At the center of this tragedy were three people: Margaret Wilson, her son Jack, and his young wife, Sarah Peters. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, everything seemed peaceful, but no one expected the dark turn of events that would forever change their lives. Margaret Wilson, a strict and authoritative woman, 58 years old, had dedicated her entire life to her family. Her husband, Michael, was a respected police officer who suddenly passed away when Jack was just 14 years old. This event became a turning point for the entire family. Margaret was left a widow with a teenage son, and from that moment on, her life revolved around Jack. She had always dreamed that Jack would follow in his father's footsteps and become a police officer, but he chose a different path. Jack Wilson, 32 years old, a successful architect, preferred a peaceful and creative profession instead of the dangerous one his father pursued. Despite his career success, his relationship with his mother had always been tense. Margaret controlled his every move, constantly criticizing his decisions, especially when it came to his personal life. She disapproved of every girlfriend he had, believing that no one would ever be good enough for her son. When Jack met Sarah Peters, it felt like his life had finally found meaning. Sarah, 28 years old, worked in marketing. She was smart, independent, and had a gentle nature. Jack fell in love with her at first sight. But Margaret immediately sensed a threat. She believed that Sarah wasn't good enough for her son, and from the very beginning, tried to tear them apart. Jack fell in love with Sarah at first sight, captivated by her sincerity and her warm, genuine nature. There was something about her that reminded him of his grandmother, his father's mother, woman who had always been the heart of the family before she passed away. Sarah had that same comforting presence, and it drew Jack to her immediately. They didn't date for long before Jack knew she was the one he wanted to spend his life with. He was ready to propose, but first, he decided to introduce Sarah to his mother, Margaret. From the moment Margaret met Sarah, she disapproved. She saw Sarah as a threat to her relationship with Jack, convinced that Sarah was not worthy of him. Margaret began to interfere, making subtle and sometimes not so subtle attempts to drive a wedge between them. She would point out Sarah's flaws, question her intentions, and criticize every detail of their relationship, hoping that Jack would eventually break things off. But Jack, having grown tired of his mother's overbearing control, realized that Margaret's behavior toward him wasn't healthy. He knew that she was trying to manipulate his choices, just as she always had. Determined to take control of his own life and follow his heart, Jack ignored his mother's disapproval and proposed to Sarah. He knew she was the one for him, and nothing his mother said would change that. Jack and Sarah were preparing for their wedding, and Sarah was glowing with happiness. She was so consumed by the upcoming celebration and her love for Jack that she tried not to focus too much on her relationship with his mother, Margaret. Sarah was wise and understood that Margaret was jealous of her son's affection. She believed it was temporary and hoped that over time, Margaret would soften. Full of hope for the future, Sarah made efforts to show Jack's mother that she cared. She wanted to give Margaret attention, inviting her for walks and discussing wedding details with her. Sarah believed that if she treated Margaret with kindness and understanding, their relationship could improve. One day, Sarah met up with her friends at a cozy cafe to share the exciting news about her upcoming wedding. She talked about Jack and how much she loved him, but she couldn't help mentioning the strange behavior of his mother, Margaret. "She's so strange sometimes," Sarah sighed, sipping her coffee. "I get that she's just jealous of Jack's affection for me, but her actions can be really childish at times. She makes odd comments and I start feeling uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels like she's trying to push me away from him." One of her friends, Lisa, frowned and quietly said, "Sarah, be careful. I've heard about mothers like that, who can't let their sons go. Sometimes it can go too far." Another friend, Kate, added, "Margaret doesn't just seem jealous. From what you're describing, she could be dangerous. Some mothers can't accept that their children have grown up. I don't like this, Sarah. Don't ignore her behavior." Sarah paused, thinking deeply. She loved Jack and believed she could handle his mother, but her friend's words made her reconsider the situation. The day of the wedding ceremony finally arrived. It was a beautiful day, and Sarah looked radiant in her wedding dress. However, as the event unfolded, Margaret's behavior became increasingly odd. While she maintained a calm and composed appearance on the surface, there were subtle signs of something darker lurking beneath. Margaret smiled and greeted the guests, but her eyes always lingered on Jack and Sarah with an intensity that made some relatives and friends feel uneasy. Her every move seemed calculated, and it was as if she was constantly restraining herself from doing something impulsive. As Jack and Sarah stood at the altar exchanging vows, Margaret's fingers twitched and she clenched her fists. Some guests, including close family and neighbors, exchanged confused and worried glances, sensing that something wasn't quite right with her. Although nothing drastic happened during the ceremony, those who were paying close attention could see that Margaret was on the verge of snapping. There was an unsettling tension in the air, as if she was mentally preparing herself for something more sinister, something only she knew about. After the wedding, Jack and Sarah returned home, full of love and happiness. They spent a wonderful evening together, enjoying the moment and dreaming about their future. The next day, Sarah decided to share the important news she had been keeping secret. She was pregnant. Sarah chose a quiet moment over breakfast to tell Jack. His face lit up with joy, and he was thrilled by the news. He hugged Sarah, and they began talking about how their life would look once the baby arrived. It was one of the happiest moments in their lives. But they both knew that they had to tell Margaret about the pregnancy as well. Jack was worried that his mother might not take the news as they hoped. He feared that her jealousy would only grow stronger and that Margaret would try to interfere even more in their lives. They decided to visit Margaret and share the news in person. However, when they arrived, they found Margaret pretending to be sick, trying to draw attention to herself. She lay in bed, complaining about her health, attempting to gain Jack's sympathy and make him come back to her under the guise that she needed constant care. When they told Margaret about Sarah's pregnancy, her reaction was strange. She gave them a cold smile and congratulated them, but beneath that smile was resentment. Margaret immediately realized that with the baby's arrival, Jack would be even further from her control. Deep down, she began to form a plan to get rid of Sarah and bring Jack back to her. The news only deepened her jealousy and hatred toward her daughter-in-law. Margaret decided that her goal was to tear them apart at any cost, and she started to act on it. After Margaret's unsettling reaction to the news of the pregnancy, Jack and Sarah tried to distance them from her, hoping to focus on their growing family. Sarah felt the tension in Margaret's presence and tried to avoid her, but Jack, driven by a sense of duty toward his mother, insisted on regular visits. Meanwhile, Margaret's health became a constant topic of conversation. She played the role of a frail, helpless woman, convincing Jack that she needed more of his attention. Sarah knew it was all an act, but Jack, blinded by guilt and responsibility, believed he had an obligation to care for his mother. Margaret's bitterness only deepened over time. She began subtly driving a wedge between Jack and Sarah, making biting remarks about Sarah's ability to be a good wife and mother. She'd say things like, "I hope you're ready for the responsibility. Sarah, raising a child isn't like working in an office." Or Jack, "You'll have to keep an eye on Sarah when the baby comes. You don't want her to get overwhelmed, do you?" Jack tried to brush off his mother's comments, but Sarah began feeling the weight of the pressure. The stress started to take a toll on her health, and Jack noticed that his usually joyful and lively wife was becoming quieter and more withdrawn. One day, after an especially tense dinner at Margaret's, Sarah broke down to Jack. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "Your mother is trying to tear us apart. She makes me feel like I'm not good enough for you or the baby." Caught between his love for Sarah and loyalty to his mother, Jack promised to speak to Margaret and set boundaries. But when he tried, Margaret twisted the situation, pretending to be deeply hurt. She accused Sarah of trying to push her out of Jack's life. "How can you believe her over me?" Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I've done everything for you, and now she's trying to take you away from me. Don't you see, Jack? She's using you." Jack left feeling confused, unsure of whom to believe. As time went on, Margaret's manipulations intensified. She began inventing stories about Sarah, telling Jack she had overheard Sarah talking to other men, or claiming that Sarah wasn't taking care of herself during the pregnancy. These false accusations began to plant seeds of doubt in Jack's mind. Then, the breaking point came. Margaret faked a severe health crisis, and she was admitted to the hospital. Jack rushed to her side, but Sarah stayed home, knowing Margaret was exaggerating her condition. This gave Margaret the perfect opportunity to play the victim. She told Jack that Sarah didn't care about her or the family, and that she would never truly love him the way she, his mother, did. After Jack left to visit his mother in the hospital, leaving Sarah alone at home, everything began to unravel. Already vulnerable from the constant stress and pressure from Margaret, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She started feeling unwell, dizziness, weakness, and sharp pains in her abdomen. The next day, Jack returned home to find Sarah lying unconscious on the living room floor. Panic overwhelmed him, and he immediately called an ambulance. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, where the doctors delivered devastating news. Due to the severe stress and physical strain, she had suffered a miscarriage. Jack was devastated. Everything they had dreamed of together, their future family, was shattered in an instant. He felt guilty for leaving her alone, but deep down, he also knew that his mother had played a role in what had happened. When Margaret learned about the miscarriage, she showed no visible emotion, other than a restrained regret. "I warned you, Jack. She's too weak to be part of our family. You should have listened to me," she coldly remarked when Jack told her about the tragedy. Sarah, still in the hospital, was utterly crushed. She had lost the baby she and Jack had dreamed of, and she felt her life falling apart under Margaret's manipulations. In that moment, she realized that Margaret would stop at nothing to destroy her marriage to Jack. When Jack came to visit Sarah in the hospital, he tried to comfort her, but their relationship was no longer the same. In her despair, Sarah said to him, "You should have chosen us. You let your mother control your life, and now we've lost our baby because of her." Torn between his love for Sarah and loyalty to his mother, Jack realized that his constant appeasement of Margaret had led to this tragedy. He promised Sarah that he would finally set firm boundaries and limit his mother's influence over their lives. However, Sarah knew that this promise might be empty. Margaret was too clever and manipulative to let her control slip so easily. She understood that unless she took decisive action, their life together would remain under threat. No one could predict what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Margaret would not stop until she had completely destroyed their marriage. After Sarah was discharged from the hospital, Jack decided to take time off work to support her during the difficult days ahead. He knew she needed time to recover and heal after the loss of their child, and he was determined to limit his mother's influence on their lives. But Margaret couldn't simply let go of the situation. When Sarah and Jack returned home, Margaret frequently called Jack, pretending to be concerned about Sarah's health, but in reality, she only cared about one thing: maintaining control over Jack's life. She was plotting, and every call was part of her game. Jack kept reassuring her that everything was fine, but Margaret didn't believe him. One evening, Jack had to leave for an urgent matter. Margaret saw this as the perfect opportunity. She knew Sarah would be home alone, and decided to visit her under the pretense of wanting to make peace. Margaret knocked on the door. Sarah, still weak from the hospital, didn't immediately sense the danger and let her mother-in-law into the house. "We need to talk," Margaret said coldly as she stepped inside. Sarah sat on the couch, and a tense conversation began between them. Margaret seemed surprisingly calm, but there was an underlying threat in her voice. "I tried to protect Jack from you," she started, never taking her eyes off Sarah. "You've ruined his life. I knew this would happen." Feeling the tension building, Sarah tried to avoid conflict. "I just want Jack and me to be happy. You want that too, don't you?" But Margaret had no intention of backing down. "You've taken my only son from me. I won't let you destroy our family." At that moment, Margaret stepped closer, her gaze filled with hatred. She pulled something shiny from her bag, a kitchen knife she had brought with her, knowing this moment would come. Sarah, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control, jumped to her feet in horror. "You won't defeat me," Margaret whispered. "Jack will never know the truth." Sarah tried to run, but her strength hadn't fully returned after the hospital. She reached the door, but Margaret caught up to her and struck the first blow. Sarah screamed in pain and fell to the floor. Consumed by rage, Margaret continued, mercilessly carrying out her plan. When it was over, Margaret stood in the silence, covered in blood. She was breathing heavily, but there was a strange satisfaction in her eyes. She knew that now no one could come between her and her son. She carefully wiped the knife clean and placed it on the kitchen counter, then picked up the phone and called Jack. "Jack," she said, her voice unexpectedly calm. "You need to come home right away. Sarah, there's been an accident." Jack, suspecting nothing, hurried back home, worried about what had happened to Sarah. When he opened the door, his heart froze. The house was eerily silent, and only Margaret sat on the couch with her arms crossed, her face pale. "Mom, what happened?" Jack asked anxiously, his voice trembling. Margaret looked at him with an innocent expression. "Sarah fell," she said quietly, gazing at her son with feigned sorrow. "I found her on the floor. I tried to help, but it was too late. I think her heart couldn't take it after everything she had been through." Jack rushed toward the kitchen, and there, his world collapsed. Sarah lay on the floor, her body still, blood staining the ground. He screamed, feeling cold horror take over his mind. He tried to find a pulse but already knew his wife was dead. A dull pain tore at his heart. "What did you do, Mom?" he asked quietly, unable to take his eyes off Sarah's body. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but his voice was cold as ice. Margaret stood up, slowly approaching her son. "Jack, it was an accident. She fell. There was nothing we could do. You must understand. I was trying to save you. She was only ruining your life, and I always knew this would end badly." Jack stood up, his gaze dark with rage. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He finally realized that his mother had orchestrated everything from the beginning. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone else occupying the place in his heart she believed belonged to her. "You killed her," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You killed Sarah." Margaret seemed unfazed by her son's accusation. "Jack, she was a threat. She was destroying everything we had. I did this for us, for the family. Now we can have a peaceful life again, like before." But Jack couldn't listen any longer. He called the police and reported his wife's death. All the while, Margaret stood beside him, her face still calm. She couldn't believe Jack would betray her. He was her son, her only child. How could he choose anyone else over her? The police arrived quickly. Margaret stood still as they arrested her. She tried to convince the officers it was an accident, that Sarah had fallen on her own. But investigators quickly realized that things weren't as she claimed. Signs of a struggle were found on the table leg, and it was clear Sarah couldn't have fallen accidentally. Jack was pulled away from Sarah's body. He watched as they carried her out of the house, and at that moment, everything he had was shattered. A long and painful process of coming to terms with the truth about his mother lay ahead. Margaret was led away in handcuffs, and only then did she realize that her plan had failed. She screamed that she had done it all for her son, but no one was listening. She was alone, just as she had been when she lost her husband. The story ended with Jack left alone. He had lost everything: his wife, his future child, and his mother, who had destroyed his life.